Welcome back to the Hall of History, and this week begins our look at the 1960s, a very dramatic, controversial point in American history. We had there are a couple large things going on during this time period. You had the Vietnam conflict kicking in, and also the civil rights movement back at home. And we're going to take a look at both of these as we go through this next section. Well, we're going to begin with the United States in Vietnam, and this is, again, by no means an all-inclusive look at what was happening in the area at this time. Many of you, if you talk to uncles or aunts or grandparents, whatever, many of them may have served in the U.S. forces during this time and have their own stories and feelings on this particular period in American history. Well, first of all, how did the U.S. become involved in Vietnam? Well, if you remember back from the 1890s and the turn of the century, the whole idea of imperialism, where these countries wanted to have lands overseas, and the French went into Southeast Asia and took over Vietnam, which was called back before the 60s French Indochina. Many of the buildings in Vietnam to this day have French architecture to it, and you can see many examples of the what the French left behind. Well, after World War II, France was an ally, and the United States would help their allies. And what was going on in Vietnam was the Viet Minh, under control of Ho Chi Minh, are a communist group, and they're pushing for independence. And again, if you look at Vietnam, they are very close, bordering with China. So that would not be too unexpected that they would have some communist leanings. And again, people want to rule themselves, and so this was the beginning of the French starting to pull out. And if you look at a regional map here, you can see China, you got Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia. All these places would definitely come into play during the 60s and into the mid 70s. Well, what ended up happening was the Viet Minh were attacking the French as a communist army, and the U.S. would enforce the Truman Doctrine to stamp out communism. If you remember, the Cold War was in full bore at this time. It was the free market democracy ideas versus the communist ideas, and the United States would fight communist takeover no matter where it would take place in the world. And U.S. joined the conflict through a theory called the domino theory. And on the next slide here, pretty much if you ever play dominoes, one falls, then the next, then the next, then the next, then the next. And that was the fear of the United States at that time, that if one country fell in Southeast Asia, they all would fall. And as you can see from our political cartoon here, again, that's Henry Kissinger, and the idea that you just keep throwing money at the problem will go away. And we learned throughout history, money really never solves the problem. It needs to be more of a change within the people themselves. The whole idea of throwing money as we get into the 70s, 80s, and so forth, and even to this time with the war on terror, the idea of just supplying money does not work. Well, what ends up happening here, Ho Chi Minh called for a popular election. So you pretty much had the communists in the north, and then you had in the southern part of the country, Diem, who was the anti-communist leader of the South, and the U.S. supported that and at the time they did not think they could win the election, the anti-communists, and so the United States backed this whole idea of just cancel the elections altogether. Interesting to note, the U.S. later supported the assassination of Diem. He was the anti-communist, and Vietnam fractured in very similar to North and South Korea. Uh, at at this time, the United States was sending in uh, pretty much just technical advisors, special forces troops, especially the Green Berets. This is the one of the I hate to say the first time, but one of the first instances of the CIA being used overseas in an advisory role too. Of course, they would deny, the involvement, but there's many of the so-called black ops going on at this time in Vietnam, in Laos, and Cambodia. Remind me to tell you a story of a gentleman I met out in Wyoming, talking about his black ops missions in Cambodia. Well, you needed something had to happen to spark really get the U.S. To go have a full scale military intervention in the area. And at the time, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, where the United States Navy was supposedly attacked by the North Vietnamese Navy. Uh, we may have to do a little more investigation on this. This You can go through history. This was the spark, but very similar circumstances. If you remember from the Spanish American War with the blowing up of the Maine in the in Cuba there, in Havana Harbor. Uh, Not a lot of factual backup for this actual attack. Well, this was the provocation, though, that really sparked the war, and Lyndon Johnson called for U.S. bombing and starts to involve ground troops. The United States thought they could win this war, drive the communists back, mostly through superior air power, which worked somewhat, but as we found out later on in many other conflicts, it's really the boots on the ground which will turn the tide, if you will, or if you're going to take over any place. Well, United States after World War II in Korea, uh, the army and military was really drawn down, and so at this time the draft was instituted. All men aged 18 to 26 entered the draft. Uh, you could get out if for something physical, mental, if you're a student, or you just draft dodging right out and out. Many young men at this time moved to Canada. Uh, Colleges saw a large enrollment at this time, and it was really ended up being known as the War of the Working Class. Again, if you talk to any of your relatives about the protest during this time, again, remember we're in the 60s, uh, and we're going to look at some of these other activities going on, the protests and the Civil Rights March. It was a very turbulent time in American history. As you can see from our final slide of this particular brief look here, in the 60s, very little troop involvement. Again, those were mostly special forces ops and so-called advisors. But by the time 1965 started going on, you can definitely see a troop buildup through the late 60s there. All right, this ends our first look here, and we'll continue on the next couple.